I'm sure that many of you will be following everything that is going on in the world right now, the Ukraine crisis, and many of us have been kind of glued to our television sets. This almost seems like, we're back to the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, the Second World War. In fact, the day that Russia invaded Ukraine, many people pointed out it seemed like September 1939 all over again, the Germans invading Poland. Now, the reason why Putin is invading Ukraine is because he's worried about the presence of Russian minorities, Russian speakers in the eastern province, the Donbass regions, as it's called, Donetsk and Luhansk. So again, the whole question of minorities and protecting minorities, which is what multiculturalism is all about, is very clear in what we are seeing right now. Although I will stress that I am one of those people who believes that multiculturalism is never adequate in terms of being able to protect the interests of minorities. So before I kind of move on and say more things, the points that I want to make in my presentation, I do want to stress that we do live in extremely fraught times, and perhaps keeping in mind the very dangerous, difficult times we're living in, I think our theorization, our understanding of society needs to adequately respond to many of these huge issues. And one of the ways to do this would be from kind of staying away from, avoiding what I can only call as the minutiae of academia, this kind of academic pedantry that a lot of us kind of, especially multicultural theorizing has got into. So I'm going to try to kind of protect myself or keep myself away from what I'm calling the minutiae, the often meaningless minutiae of academia, the inanities that quite often theorizing gets into, and especially multicultural theorizing, which would often get into this kind of pedantry and this meaning, this inane detail. So having outlined why I'm taking 2011 as a kind of a base year to understand the perils and crises of multiculturalism, let me also point out certain other things that were happening in 2011, that year that I kind of identified as a base year. Now, if you recall, this was the beginning of the Arab Spring, as it was called, the events in Tunisia, where it all began, they rapidly spread to Cairo. Tahrir Square became the most important public square where the events of the Arab Spring were playing out. It led to the end of Hosni Mubarak's rule in Egypt after almost 3 decades in power. The happenings of the Arab Spring spread very, very quickly to many, many other parts of the Arab world. So Yemen, for example, or Bahrain, these were various countries that were affected by the Arab Spring. There was a great deal of optimism because it was all about this kind of a thirst for democracy that the Arab world seemed to be kind of expressing, a part of the world that has not traditionally been associated with the presence or the flourishing of democracy. Now, I do want to stress that quite often a lot of multicultural theorizing has been linked to democracy, or at least that's the way that a lot of people like me initially understood multiculturalism, as this attempt to broaden democracy by making it more culturally representative, to be able to bring in people from different cultural persuasions or different kind of cultural backgrounds, whatever you want to call it. So the Arab Spring, as I said a little while ago, was all about this thirsting for democracy in the Arab world, which, as I pointed out, has never been known as a part of the world where democracy has prevailed or flourished or thrived. Now, the tragedy of the Arab Spring perhaps was that it seemed to kind of very quickly degenerate into an autumn very quickly. It was almost as if the spring had just blossomed, and within a few passing moments, it had very tragically kind of become an autumn, which was very disappointing. 2011 was also, if you recall, the year of the Occupy Wall Street movement. September 2011, in New York, Zuccotti Park, there were many people who protested against the growing inequalities in the world that had been created by neoliberalism and the 2007 financial crisis. So what I am suggesting is that 2011 is a very significant year in order to understand where we stand right now, and if we are to understand where the world is right now. And so someone like me, I believe that the world is in a pretty bad situation because there is serious talk of World War III. So I'm, in order to understand the present predicament that we are in, I'm suggesting that let's take a look at 2011, because that might explain the origins of many problems that this decade has unfolded. Also, closer home in India, the 2011 movement was the year of the Anna movement, this remarkable upsurge against corruption. Shruti, I remember, would have been a student at that time, if I'm not wrong, Shruti, and I recently joined and we would have many, many intense discussions about the Anna movement. I was never very enthusiastic about the Anna movement because I always felt that any movement against corruption tends to kind of degenerate into a certain kind of authoritarianism, which I think it did. And I always thought the Anna movement had a certain kind of authoritarian streak underlying it, and perhaps I think I've been vindicated in terms of everything that's happened. But anyway, that's my kind of laying out how I intend to kind of present my arguments as in terms of the Perils and Crises. 2011, as I said, is the year that I'm kind of taking as a base year to understand many things that happened. The problem with a lot of hi Anjay, good to see you. I can see a lot of familiar faces, friends from JNU. As I said, the problem with a lot of multiculturalism has always been that it has been focused on certain symbolic cultural aspects that have never been linked to deeper aspects of discrimination. Now, one criticism of multiculturalism has been that it has never been able to address what is called material inequality. So this is a point that Brian Barry made in a 2001 book called Culture and Equality, and this is perhaps one of the most sustained critiques of multiculturalism, as a set of ideas that never really took seriously the material deprivation that many, many people from disadvantaged communities felt. I mean, it was very well to talk about the cultural disadvantage that many groups felt, experienced. For example, if Sikh communities in Canada or in many other parts of the world were unable to or had difficulty or faced discrimination wearing a turban, or Muslim women wearing the hijab, or Palestinians the kafia, or Sikh or Jewish men wearing the yarmulke, that small cap that Jewish men wore. So it was all very well to talk about these things. Multiculturalism was particularly adept at talking about these aspects of cultural discrimination, but then it was never able to link these aspects of cultural discrimination to material disadvantage and material deprivation. And that was in many ways the point that especially people like Brian Barry made in his book Culture and Equality. And as I said, for me, this was the most sustained attack on multiculturalism in terms of its inability or its blind spot or its unwillingness to actually be able to look at other sources of minority disadvantage, in addition to the cultural disadvantage that it was, as I said, particularly adept at looking at. Also brings me to another theorist that many people may be familiar with, and that is Nancy Fraser, who rather dismissively referred to liberal multiculturalism as being the cultural analog of the liberal welfare state. Now, the point that Fraser made about multiculturalism and the liberal welfare state was that, they did address or acknowledge the fact that there were certain groups that were feeling discriminated or that they were not getting their fair share. But then they were never able to really go down deep into the roots of where this discrimination came from. So in Fraser's famous distinction, the discrimination that multiculturalism and the liberal welfare state were addressing, the way they did it was, rather than being transformative, was affirmative. I mean, that's a crucial distinction that she's making. Let me just try to explain what she says, because some people may not be familiar with this distinction. But the point is that if there is a particular discrimination that is manifesting itself against people, it is important to try to go deep down into the underlying structures of discrimination. By addressing those underlying structures of discrimination, the response would be a transformative response. It would actively seek to bring change to those deep down underlying structures of discrimination. Rather than doing this, what multiculturalism did was it remained on a surface level, very superficially addressing discrimination. And by doing so, the point that Fraser is making is that it remained a rather affirmative form of addressing minority disadvantage. So the complaint against multiculturalism from people like Brian Barry and Nancy Fraser has been that it's very superficial, it is merely surface level, it skims the surface and doesn't go deep down into the root causes of what is causing discrimination. It would be akin to trying to cure the symptoms of a disease rather than trying to cure the underlying disease itself. That's the way that it would be looked at. So I'm bringing all of this up to suggest that there was something deeply problematic about multiculturalism policies, that they had a certain superficial element to them, and that superficiality was perhaps the limitation of these policies, and perhaps it was that limitation that we see in terms of the kind of blowback to multiculturalism, if I can call it that we see today, and I'll talk about that in a little while. Again, in terms of what I'm calling this base year, as I call it, 2011. Let me just say this once again, because this does form a very important part of everything that I'm going to say. My point is that I'm taking 2011 because of what I feel were two very specific manifestations of a very deep-seated opposition to multiculturalism. So those people who have just joined or who may have joined late, I'm trying to suggest that, well, I mean, the statement by the then British Prime Minister David Cameron in February 2011 at the Munich Security Conference, where he talked about the failures of official multiculturalism. And he also talked about the particular problematic strain of Islam that he felt jeopardized and threatened the security of Europe especially. And again, in July that year, later that year in 2011, the incident, a very tragic incident in Norway, Anders Behring Breivik, gunning down many youngsters at a youth camp and complaining about multiculturalism and the official presence of Islam. So those are the two major, as I keep saying, events of that year, in addition to the other points that I made about what was happening in the world in 2011, which have prompted me to kind of go into the perils and crises of multiculturalism. Now, again, to kind of focus a little more on the terms that I'm using in my title, the crises of multiculturalism is basically its inability to be able to focus on material deprivation, to merely look at, in a very superficial way, the cultural manifestations of disadvantage. Now, why am I saying this so much? I'm saying this so much because 4 years before 2011, you had the global financial crisis in the world, a major crisis which led to a great deal of turmoil in especially the major economies. I think in India, we were buffered by the decisions that were taken by the Reserve Bank of India at that time. I think Y.V. Reddy was the governor. I don't think the adverse effects hit us so badly in those days as they hit, let's say, economies like the US, the UK, or many European economies. But I'm bringing all of this up to talk about the greater levels of inequality. I don't think the world has experienced such high levels of inequality as we are experiencing right now. I don't have the statistics or the numbers in front of me, but I'm sure that many of you will be familiar with some of these statistics. Basically, what we are, the situation that we are living in right now, is a situation of extreme inequality, an inequality which is simply unsustainable. And I've been recently reading a book by a historian called Walter Scheidel called The Great Level. And basically the point that Scheidel is making is that if such extreme levels of inequality are experienced in a society, then there will be different mechanisms through which that inequality, is eliminated or done away with. One of them that he suggests is war, and we can see that looming very large in the events in the last 10 days as Russia has decided to invade Ukraine on the pretext, I think the pretext is important, on the pretext of protecting the minority Russian speakers in the eastern region of Ukraine, which is referred to as Donbass. All right, now let me move on now. Having talked about 2011 in a certain sort of a way, what I now want to suggest is that the fallout of these crises of 2011, everything that was happening around that time, has led to a great deal of instability and turmoil. Okay, it has created a certain kind of crisis of democracy itself, where we don't really know if in the next few years democracy will prevail in our country, or for that matter in many other parts of the world. As I keep saying, I am one of those people who believe that given the dire situation that the world is in right now, we may be reliving the acutely disturbing decades of the 1920s and the 1930s, just before the Second World War. That is how bad the situation in the world right now is. Now, in terms of how bad the situation is, what I'm suggesting is that ideas like multiculturalism stand absolutely no chance in front of these large, powerful, massive forces that we are arrayed against. So once again, just to kind of emphasize the point that I'm making, what I am suggesting is that given everything that has happened in the last decade, since 2011, we are perhaps reliving the turmoil, the turbulence, the trouble of the 1930s and 1920s, just before the Second World War. Now, given this kind of the immensity of the scale of the political challenges, An idea like multiculturalism, which was always, I felt, has had a certain kind of surface level superficiality to it, does not really stand too much of a chance, and hence my title, The Perils of Multiculturalism. Multiculturalism has a perilous existence in front of the massive forces that we see arrayed in front of us. Now, I will stop. Let's say around 4:40, and hopefully, if there are questions, I will respond to those questions because I'm always interested in listening to the questions people have. So, my next point then is that in terms of the political changes that the world was experiencing around 2011, so I've talked about the combination of the Arab Spring, about the Occupy Wall Street movement, and in India, the Anna movement. What we experienced throughout the 2000s to 2010s was a rise of a particular kind of authoritarian populism, not just in India, but all over the world. You look at Brazil, you look at the US, you look at Britain, you look at France, you look at the Philippines, you look at Hungary. There is a certain kind of a global trend at play where increasingly, right-wing authoritarian populist leaders are coming to power. And by coming to power, there is a certain kind of discomfiture with the practice of democracy that one can see, which is what has led many political scientists to suggest that what we may be witnessing is a particular kind of end or termination of democracy. So I'm sure that many of you will be familiar with this kind of literature. Many books have come out on this possibility of the end of democracy. So Daniel Levitsky and Stephen Ziblatt, two Harvard professors who wrote the book How Democracies Die, followed by an Australian political theorist that I read quite a lot, Mark Chow, who talks about the suicide of democracy. Now, again, I'm bringing all of this up to suggest that in the face of these massive challenges that are of an almost tectonic scale, an idea like multiculturalism has pretty much no chance whatsoever, which is why I keep calling it the perils of multiculturalism. It has a perilous existence in front of everything that we see in front of us. Now, again, to go back to the way that the 2010s was evolving and developing, again, keeping in mind everything that is going on in the world right now, what struck me in the year 2014, the year that the Modi government came to power in India, were other things that were happening in the world. If you recall, keeping in mind the current crisis, that was the year in which the Russians decided to, go into Crimea, that very important peninsula on the Black Sea. And that felt very strange. What it seemed to indicate was that these were not normal times, that there was something wrong in the 21st century if one power decides to move into another. And again, we see the lack of normality, again, in what we are witnessing. Also, in June that year, all of a sudden, we were made aware of an entity called the Islamic State that emerged in the regions of Syria and Iraq. The ISIS, as it was called, the Islamic State in Syria. Yes, 2014, that's what I'm saying. 2014 is the year. Aditya has just reminded. 2014, around February or March, the Russians decided to invade Crimea. 2014, June, the Islamic State was all of a sudden emerged. Now, I'm bringing all of this up to suggest that this indicates that this decade was unfolding in a particularly, to my mind, distasteful sort of a way. What was happening across the world was a certain kind of extreme political views being voted into power. So in 2016, 2 years later, the two major developments that happened that year were the Brexit referendum and the victory of President Donald Trump in the US, which seemed to confirm that 5 years after 2011, the decade was increasingly moving towards a very strange kind of a configuration, that certainly these were not normal times whatsoever. And again, as the decade concluded, the abnormality of the times became even much more clear to many people. Now, I'm just going to focus on Brexit a little because I have recently written a book on Brexit and the whole question of British multiculturalism. Now, I've looked at Brexit, the decision by the United Kingdom to leave the European Union, as an extremely problematic decision. That was on the 23rd of June 2016, there was a referendum that was held in the UK where voters were asked whether they wanted to leave the European Union or stay in the European Union. By a majority of 52%, the voters said that they wanted to leave the European Union because they felt that the European Union was constraining the UK, that somehow the UK needed to assert its sovereignty and get back its sovereignty from the European Union. Now, the problem with Brexit was that the grievance that underlay it was very genuine, but the manifestation of this grievance was very problematic. Why? Because it was animated by an exclusive English nationalism that had a hatred for the immigrant. And therefore, I am looking at Brexit as a political development that significantly undermines the practice of British multiculturalism. One country which in many ways has been very self-consciously multicultural. Well, actually, the thing about the British is that they're never self-conscious about many things. They always do things in a state of absent-mindedness. So they conquered India and they got the empire and subjugated us for 200 years in that famous expression, in a fit of absent-mindedness. And I think something very similar happened with Brexit, the referendum. People were misinformed about the implications of leaving the European Union. To be very blunt, the people were lied to. A lie was told to them. The lie that was told to them was that if we left the European Union, I mean, we referring to the British, if they left the European Union, then they would be able to save 350 million pounds that could then be channelized into other things like funding the National Health Service. So my point really is that what we see is democracy becoming being informed or election campaigns increasingly being conducted on the base of a mass misinformation campaign. And one could see that very clearly in the Brexit referendum. But my major interest in the discussion today is to suggest that what Brexit did was create a certain kind of hysteria and hatred against immigrants. That hysteria and hatred against immigrants and the kind of racism that has escalated in British society is, it shows the way in which the simplicities of multicultural tolerance have been set aside. I'm just going to move on to my next point, which is that when I think about multiculturalism in its various forms, and I'll try to look at its variants across the world. Let me attempt a definition of multiculturalism, which I thought I'd do in the beginning, but then I thought of explaining and elucidating many of the aspects of the 2011 base year that I'm taking. Now, let me try to explain or elaborate or define multiculturalism. Now, it's an attempt to very self-consciously bring about and guarantee equality for different cultural and ethnic groups in the public sphere. Okay, so let me say this once again. The way that I'm understanding it is it's a very self-conscious attempt to bring about, to guarantee, to affirm equality for different groups, ethnic, religious, minority, linguistic groups in the public sphere. Now, the reason why multiculturalism has to do this is because the public sphere does not generally reflect this kind of heterogeneity and diversity. And because it is likely to be swamped by a certain cultural heterogeneity and lack of diversity, multiculturalism tries to redress that situation. Again, the point that I would stress, going back to my title, in terms of the crises and perils of multiculturalism, it's something that it is not able to do very well at all. It may perhaps make an attempt, but the attempt is what we would call an attempt of bravado, which is likely to fail. This also makes multiculturalism distinct from cultural pluralism, which has been something which we have always found. I mean, many of you are perhaps sitting in Banaras, because this question, this topic ko explain kar rahe hain. So I think that is very clear, Jitesh, from the title itself, which is multiculturalism. So if you just have a look at the title, aapko topic pata chal jayega. Okay, having responded to that question from Jitesh, let me try to move on. Let me just say this once again. What I'm trying to say is multiculturalism is a self-conscious attempt to affirm, bring about, guarantee equality for different groups, linguistic, ethnic, religious, in the public sphere, in the public domain. Why does it have to do this? It has to do this because there's a tendency for the public sphere not to represent that diversity, to fail to represent that particular diversity. This makes it different from cultural pluralism. What does one mean by cultural pluralism? So since many of you may be in Banaras, which is a great city in terms of its rich history and heritage. Things that we call, for example, which people don't talk about these days, the syncretic Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb. Okay, a lot of young people don't know these ideas. These were ideas that people like me grew up with. This is how I understood myself as a northerner. The syncretic Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb, the culture that was created along the banks of the Ganga and the Jamuna of the north, that brought together different groups and where there was a certain kind of a congeniality. Yeah, there was, I think, some problem with the connection, which has just been restored.
Please continue, Dr. Amir.
My apologies. The connection, which usually doesn't, is not erratic, but something happened. So again, let me come back to this particular point that I'm trying to make, which is in some ways a pretty central part of what of what I'm trying to put forward here. Why does this self-conscious step need to be done? It has to be done because of the nature of the nation state. Now, this is something that was made by an Israeli political theorist back in the 1990s in a book called Liberal Nationalism. The theorist in question is someone called Amir, a book I remember reading in terms of my early attempts to understand multiculturalism. Now, the point that Amir is making is that there is a tendency on the part of the nation state not to reflect diversity. So let me just try to kind of emphasize this. What I'm suggesting is that there is the nation state tends to obliterate, tends to not be able to represent cultural diversity. Since it is unable to represent diversity, therefore there must be made a self-conscious attempt to represent that diversity in the public domain, and that is exactly what a lot of multiculturalism is all about. Now again, to go back to the points that I made in the beginning, this is something that it is not always able to do very successfully. It quite often fails in this particular task. Now, the public sphere, it's a concept that a lot of political scientists work with. What is the nature, what is the notion of the public sphere? This is first talked about back in the 1960s by the German theorist. Some of you may have heard of the German theorist or may have read his work, Jürgen Habermas, a very, very famous and distinguished political theorist. The point that Habermas makes is that the public sphere tends to be fragmented. That means वो टूट जाता है. And when it tends to be fragmented, it has a problem in being able to represent divergent, distinct points of view. Now, I want to make a more contemporary observation. And that contemporary observation, keeping in mind the fact that I'm looking at the 2010s, you will also recall that the 2010s is a decade in which social media has become very, very prominent. I'm sure that many of you use social media. Some of you may be on Facebook or Twitter. I'm not on Facebook. I don't use Twitter. I'm not a great fan of social media. But the point that I want to bring up is that what social media has done is that it has completely eliminated the possibility of reason in the public sphere. Now, why am I saying this? I'm saying this because when Jürgen Habermas talked about the public sphere, he talked about the presence of reason in the public sphere. Now, reason is a particular way of argumentation, where there is a certain kind of a logic, there is a certain kind of a rationale that is put forward. What we see in today's world, especially in the 2010s, especially in the way that democracy has evolved in India, in America, in Britain, in Europe, in Russia, in Ukraine, or any other part of the world, is a certain kind of hatred that is being expressed towards different people. So what we see and again, many people have talked about this, is a certain kind of hatred that is expressed towards the other. It's very distasteful, it's very nasty to see this. Now, in different societies, this hatred is manifested in different ways. So in the UK, for example, it could be racism. In India, it is communalism and casteism. In the US, again, it is racism. But the point that I want to bring up is that multiculturalism as a set of ideas was meant to counter specifically this form of hatred. So if it was trying to bring about a certain equality in the public domain, it was also trying to guarantee a certain respect for different groups in the public domain. Now, contrasted to that, आज हम क्या देखते हैं? आज हम देखते हैं कि public domain में, in the domain of the social media, in the media, what we see is intense hatred, नफरत एक दूसरों के लिए. अब टीवी डिबेट्स तो मैंने देखना छोड़ दिया है. I don't watch our television news channels anymore. But what one notices are slanging matches, जहाँ पर बहस नहीं होती है, एक दूसरों के खिलाफ नफरत फैलाई जाती है, which is a very unhealthy situation. Now, again, to go back to why I call my talk today the Perils and Crises of Multiculturalism. Multiculturalism was an attempt to bring about equality and respect for different groups in the public domain. What we see today is the complete opposite of that. What we see in the public domain because of social media is the presence of intense levels of hatred and intolerance for different groups, which is very concerning and very problematic. And a lot of people, especially in the universities, young people like many of you who are maybe listening to this, and I talk especially about the students, perhaps should be very concerned about this. Now, as I keep saying, this is true not just of India, but it's also true of Britain. Now, let me give you an example of this because, as I said, a lot of my recent writings on multiculturalism focus on the UK and the Brexit vote that happened in the UK. Before the referendum happened, okay, the 2016 referendum in which many citizens of the UK decided to leave the European Union, a British member of parliament was killed in her parliamentary constituency. Uska naam Jo Cox tha. Okay, she was killed. She was killed by a man who shouted, "Britain first." I want you to focus on what he's saying. The man, before he killed this Labour MP, member of parliament, at that time when she was killed, she was just 43 years old. The man shouted, "Britain first." 6-7 months later, when Donald Trump came to power in the US, in his inaugural address, he said, "America first." Now, the point that I want to make is that the more nations want to put themselves first, the more they are likely to relegate humanity to the last. And this is why I'm suggesting that the decade that has gone by has been such a problematic decade that has culminated in the kind of situation that we face in the world right now. Again, what I want to kind of reiterate is that the situation that we are facing in the world right now is very, very serious. The day before yesterday, when I heard the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, talking about World War III, I thought that never in my lifetime would I have thought that we would be in such a dangerous and precarious situation. ये सोचने का मुकाम है for all of us who do social sciences. आखिर क्या वजह थी कि इन 10 सालों में स्थिति इतनी खराब हो गई कि हम लोग एक थर्ड वर्ल्ड वॉर के सिचुएशन पर खड़े हुए हैं. And again, what I'm suggesting is that nations were not able to address issues of discrimination adequately within their own borders. Most nations. I think most nations in the world. Multiculturalism, as I keep saying, was an attempt, but it was perhaps a half-hearted attempt. It was an attempt that was not good enough because it tried to bring about and affirm a certain kind of equality and respect in the public domain. It was something that it could never do. And therefore, we are now in a situation where the world is perhaps in one of its most dangerous inflection points, and I would dare to say in its recent history. I think since the Second World War, this is perhaps one of the most dangerous inflection points. Why is this happening? I'll try to make my final points within the next 5-6 minutes, and then I'll open things up for questions. I'm sure and hope there will be questions which I'll try to answer. One thing that we have witnessed is the concept of citizenship becoming increasingly more troublesome, and embroiled in controversy. I'm referring to a range of literature जो multiculturalism के debates में emerge हुए हैं. तो अगर आपको याद होगा मेरे लेक्चर में शुरुआत में मैंने ब्रायन बैरी का जिक्र किया था. ब्रायन बैरी जो 2001 में उन्होंने बुक लिखी थी कल्चर एंड इक्वालिटी, who critiqued multiculturalism. Again एक और थियोरिस्ट जिसका मैंने जिक्र किया था नैंसी फ्रेजर, जो अगेन ये कह रही है कि मल्टीकल्चरलिज्म के अंदर एक सुपरफिशियलिटी है, एक सतही उसके अंदर वो गहराई में नहीं जा सकता है, और ये इसका लिमिटेशन है जो मैं I agree with what Fraser is saying. Let me bring up another book that was written towards the end of the 20th century by perhaps one of the most famous theorists of multiculturalism, a Canadian theorist जिनका नाम है Will Kimlicka. उन्होंने एक book लिखी थी Multicultural Citizenship. And the point that I want to make is that in the world right now, what we face is the concept of citizenship becoming an extremely problematic concept. Famously, the political theorist Hannah Arendt defined citizenship as the right to have rights. And again, this is a definition that many of you may be aware of. But what I'm trying to suggest is that as nation states become more insular, as they kind of turn against any notion of multiculturalism, what they are likely to do is to imperil their minorities much, much more. And not only do they imperil their minorities, but increasingly what they are doing is that they are endangering the social fabric of which they are a part. भारत में हो रहा है ये, ब्रिटेन में हो रहा है, यूएस में खास के डोनाल्ड ट्रंप के अंदर ये बहुत ज्यादा हो रहा था in terms of the invective or hatred जो डोनाल्ड ट्रंप बोलते थे against, for example, immigrants, Mexicans के खिलाफ, blacks के खिलाफ, against Muslims. Now, my final point, the point that I'm really trying to struggle to make at the end of all of this, is that these forms of hatred, they take different forms. Racism is one of them. Communalism in India is another form of hatred. Casteism is another form of hatred. All these forms of hatred in the past were sought to be countered by ideas like multiculturalism. Okay? Now the problem with multiculturalism, and I keep saying, I'm looking at the crisis and perils. कमी क्या थी multiculturalism? Where did it go wrong? उसका limitation क्या? Limitation ये था कि it countered these different, it could not effectively counter these hatreds, these forms of discrimination. At the most, it contained them. एक रोक लगा के रखा, एक थोड़ा सा हल्का सा लगाम लगा के रखा उनको. और जब किसी चीज पर एक रोक लगाते हैं, at some point the barriers will break and it all comes tumbling out. So once again, the final point that I'm trying to make about multiculturalism is its problem and its major limitation was that it could at most contain these different forms of hatred, but could never effectively counter those forms of hatred. And because of this, what we are witnessing in the world right now is this vast exponential growth of hatred, which actually should really concern all of us. Because what it is doing is, it is dehumanizing us not as just as citizens, but as individuals. And I think especially political theorists and social scientists need to ask themselves a question, where exactly all of this is leading. Okay, I'm just going to make one last point. This is reference to things that have happened in India, close to Karnataka, where you've had the hijab controversy. Now, when this broke out, the thing that I was struck by was two things. Okay, these were debates that had already happened 20 years ago. Okay, in countries like France, for example, in countries like Turkey, these debates had already happened and many of these issues were resolved. It was felt that people had the right to wear whatever they want to wear. Now, when these debates started happening, मुझे बहुत अफसोस लगा कि जो 20 साल पहले के debates लोगों को लगा कि वो resolve हो चुके हैं, वो दोबारा सामने आ रहे हैं. Okay, so that was the strange kind of a thing that I felt in terms of the hijab controversy, which is to stress a very multicultural debate, because many of these multicultural debates emerged in France, in Britain, in the US, in Canada, over headgear. So let me just give you an example of this from our part of the world, people from our part of the world. Canada, there's a regiment called the Mounties, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Now, उनके uniform में एक hat होता है जो Stetson कहलाता है, वो बहुत wide brimmed सा एक hat होता है, it has a wide brim. Now, when Sikhs, members of the Sikh community, wanted to join the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Force, the problem was the uniform, because Sikhs wear turbans and they could therefore not wear the hats that were the regulation uniform of the RNCP, the Mounties. उस रूल को चेंज किया गया ताकि Sikhs could wear turbans and also be part of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is why I'm saying that when these issues arose in Karnataka a month ago, I was very disappointed because I thought that many of these issues, multicultural issues, had already been resolved. The fact that they have not been resolved would again be, to my mind, an expression of the failures of multiculturalism, which reinforces my point about the perils and crises of multiculturalism. Now it's around 4:45, so I've taken 43-44 minutes. I will stop there, and if there are questions, I'd be very happy to answer those questions on the basis of the things that I have said.
Thank you, Dr. Ali, for a very enlightening lecture. And now I request my colleagues, but above all, I request my students, my research students, my MS students to ask questions.
Hello, I have a question.
Hi, Ishant. Good to see you.
Hi, Dr. Ali. So what I was thinking was, I have been thinking on these lines for a while, and on what you mentioned as Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb, multiculturalism as in Europe, and a broader understanding or maximal understanding of secularism in India. Do you not think that we also bandwagon it to an idea of certain kind of progressive direction of politics in which it is hitched? What is wrong if minority communities, or even the majority community within a certain extent wants to express a certain kind of a conservative political position? Say, let's say the hijab. Let's accept the hijab is also an expression of Muslim identity, and more conservative expression of Muslim identity. What's wrong in that? Like, that's fairly legitimate, right?
Yeah.
And why? And also, there is also a certain aesthetic expression around the whole debate of Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb. Bismillah Khan, the great Shehnai Wadak. But if, let us say, Bismillah Khan was not such a great Shehnai Wadak, that should not have an impact on the citizenship status and the rights of ordinary Muslims in Banaras or rest of North India. So the whole, did we go somewhere wrong when we have aesthetized the whole ethic of secularism and made a maximalist argument that, secularism, we will have more rights for women, we will also have socialism tagged along with it. Are we not better if secularism is, we begin with the very bottom of understanding of secularism, first ensuring that rights, physical security and socio-economic rights of minorities are ensured.
So yes, Ishant, I would agree with you. I completely agree with you that there is a certain basic minimum, but that really is the issue right now. Right now we are in this country witnessing a situation where there are certain people for whom basic physical security is not guaranteed. Now, the reason why we think we have arrived at this situation is because, I think there's been a kind of a constant kind of whittling away of secularism in this country. It's been made into a dirty word. However, let me ask you to look at one thing. Go back to the hijab debates. Now, you will notice just think of the position that the Hindutva groups are now taking. They are now saying, no expression, religious expression. Okay, no hijab, no saffron shawl, nothing. Now that is a classic secularism as laicite position, the one that was taken in France and Turkey. So this is the whole irony. It's taking twists and turns. So I agree with you that basic physical security is a must. Okay, I agree with you completely. But at the same time, what we think of it, for example, the reason why I brought up Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb is because this was a unself-conscious way for people to exist in the northern part of the country. Now, I don't hear that term anymore. I just don't hear it. So again, to underline this point, the NDTV correspondent Kamal Khan, for example, who was very familiar with bananas. When he died, a lot of people said, well, this is an example of the composite culture of this country. Okay. Now, I'm also trying to make a distinction between the composite culture of Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb and multiculturalism. My point is that there's a certain kind of limitation of multiculturalism. The more it tries to affirm the rights of minorities, the less effective it is able to do so. But I don't know. I mean, where perhaps multiculturalism goes wrong is its inability to understand what exactly is culture and the dynamics of cultural change. You cannot preserve cultures. You can't preserve minority cultures. Cultures are things which are dynamic. They keep changing. They change according to circumstances, according to historical time periods. So if I were to kind of bring up two limitations, I think it would be in terms of the conceptualization of how to protect minorities, and secondly, in terms of merely protecting them in cultural terms. That would be the problem. But on your last point, I would agree with you completely. And perhaps this is something for many of us to reflect on. Why is it that we have now reached a situation in which there are certain people in our country who are just not physically safe? That is a great failure on the part of all of us, and something that we need to collectively think about. Aakhir aisi kya wajah? And not just India. Why are we now in a situation in the world where we are perhaps on the verge of the possible outbreak of a global conflagration in the form of a global war? Okay, I hope that answers your question.
I will write a mail about the extended process. I mean,
I look forward to that.
So, a few months ago, the Western country has commented about India that Indian democracy is going to become autocracy. Is it right or wrong, sir?
Well, if you ask me, Prince, I think you're referring to the VDEM Institute from the University of Gothenburg. They've just come out with their report for the second year running. They have referred to India as an electoral autocracy. And I would largely agree with this. I think there has been a complete degeneration of the quality of our democracy. What does the quality of democracy mean? The quality of democracy means not just elections, but it means the process of democratization. How is it empowering citizens? Are citizens able to hold their governments into account? Are they experiencing an improvement of their lives? Now, on many indicators, Prince, we are slipping, and I think that this is again a cause for collective concern. We are really in a situation in which democracy is endangered, and the VDEM Institute report, I think, one doesn't have to accept it totally, but something certain that we need to accept rather than completely dismiss, which I have noticed is the major response these days to any of these reports that are coming out. So on major indicators, for example, on press freedom index, we have slipped. On the hunger index, we have slipped. And I think that the fact that on many of these indicators we are slipping means that we really need to give this a thought rather than just dismissing it out of hand. You don't have to accept everything that these reports say, but they certainly do need to be taken very seriously. The International Committee for Religious Freedom in the US has expressed its concerns. Now, many bodies across the world are expressing a concern at the state of politics and democracy in India, and I think this is time for all of us to collectively kind of start thinking very hard. So, Prince, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Sir.
Yeah, Raj Hans.
Thank you, sir, for this wonderful lecture. My question is, sir, that I recently heard an interview of S.J. Sangha where he was mentioning about the tendency of liberal fundamentalism that is in rise in Western democracies per se, where they are passing out judgments on every Eastern democracies. So, where do you see that is the tendency a truth, or is it just a statement given by a politician? And the second question is that there is also a tendency of rising conservatism under the packet of multiculturalism. I mean, there are every sort of conservative and extremist people who are under the garb of being a multicultural person, trying to persuade our society in a very conservative direction. So, what is your opinion on that?
Well, those are very good questions, Raj. I think let me begin with the second question first. I completely agree with you that under the garb of multiculturalism, a certain kind of fundamentalism has been kind of accepted. And I think what this has done is that it has imperiled many societies. So the concerns that people have expressed have been about practices like, for example, female genital mutilation. and many other issues. So I agree with you on that second point that you're making. This point about multiculturalism becoming this kind of, what it did was it created a patchwork of separate ghettos where people stopped living along with each other. They started living separately, and that is what ghettos do. So again, this goes back to the point that I was trying to make about the failures and the perils and the pitfalls and the crises of multiculturalism. I think that there was a certain indulgent attitude towards practices that were clearly very problematic in terms of a certain encouragement towards religious fundamentalism. So on that point, I think that's a very good point to make. On the point about liberal fundamentalism, passing judgment is something that we all do, and I don't think we should be very thick-skinned about this. I'm reminded of Manish Shankar Iyer and the book that he wrote, where he called his book Confessions of a Secular Fundamentalist. Now, fundamentalism of any kind is always problematic, whether it is secular fundamentalism or religious fundamentalism or liberal fundamentalism. Because the problem with fundamentalism is that it takes things too literally. I mean, there's a kind of a literalist interpretation. So I would be a slightly, kind of differentiate my own position with respect to your own point. I think that many Western countries and many, for example, human rights organizations are expressing a great deal of concern. A lot of the time, those concerns, I agree with you, tend to be problematic, that they are a kind of passing of a judgment. At the same time, what we cannot overlook is that there may be some substance to those judgments that are being made. And again, to go back to the point that I made in response to Prince's question, many of these reports that emerge, one doesn't have to agree with them completely, but one can't dismiss them also. I mean, the fact that they are making certain references to many of our societies means that we need to take a closer look at what may be going wrong. And there's a old saying that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And I think it's also important to be on the lookout for any aspect of our own societies that are slipping into a certain kind of authoritarianism, into a certain kind of intolerance, into a certain kind of illiberality. I mean, in the West, for example, certainly Trump's America was an example of an illiberal democracy. I mean, if Trump had come back to power, I think that country would have become worse. In a country like Hungary, for example, where you have an authoritarian leader like Viktor Orban, he has very clearly kind of expressed his opposition to liberal democracy. So, because your question, the first part of your question was on liberalism, I think what we have here is the possible demise of liberal democracy itself. Again, the whole range of literature books that has come out by people like Dvitsky and Ziblatt. And I think we should be worried about this, because liberal democracy, of course, is an imperfect kind of democracy. But the thing about democracy, we've been told, is that it's the least worst form of government. And we need to be on the lookout to see that we do not lose it. Because I think this is quite a significant achievement when so many people are able to participate in the political process. But having said that, let me say, democracy is just not elections. It's just not the routine of voting. It's more than that. It involves a process of democratization. So, Raj, I hope that answers your question, which I thought was very good.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, Shagun.
Sir, how can we talk about uniform civil code in multiculturalism like India?
You see, Shagun, the uniform civil code is one of the most fraught political issues, and I think that this is an issue that never gets debated. Personally, I'm not against uniform civil code, if you ask me, because a lot of the personal laws have problems. But the problem, and you can kind of verify this, no one has ever come up with a proper blueprint of what uniform civil code could or should be like. It is always a form of political rhetoric that is used to polarize. And when you have rhetoric that polarizes, you cannot have a genuine political debate. So I think that is really the problem with the uniform civil code. Now the question then arises is, would we want that kind of uniformity? That's an area that I can't really get into. The one person that I have read is Flavia Agnes on this, in which she suggests that there is a certain kind of a process in which you can have a continuous gradual transformation within different personal laws. So I think that would be the best way to go about it. It's more a kind of rhetoric that has been used rather than a genuine attempt to bring about transformation, which is what the Uniform Civil Code should have been all about, but unfortunately has not become about that. So Shagun, I hope that answers the question. There are lots of questions popping up in the chat box.
So,
yeah, should I answer the questions in the chat box, or how do you want me to do this?
Yes, answer the question, sir.
Sorry, Puzaro?
I'm saying that you see the questions in the chat box and you please answer to them.
let me just address this question, some of these questions that have popped up in the chat. Harsh is asking me, why are you blaming only secular countries? You're not saying any single word about the so-called Islamic countries. Well, Harsh, if you were there for the first part of my lecture, I did talk about the Arab Spring. I did bewail the fact that the Arab Spring had great promise in it, but that promise was very tragically transformed into, the promise was never fulfilled. So I don't know, perhaps you were not there for the first part of my lecture. I did talk about the lack of democracy in many of the Arab worlds, which is, I think, what you want to kind of bring up. Palak has asked me for what may be the reasons for major divisions and a kind of polarization being created between the intelligentsia, academics, and the populist discourses, which are at times villainizing the former, which is being witnessed especially in India, and what may be a possible way of this. So, Palak, just to respond to your question, populism, the problem with it is that it's anti-intellectual, it is anti-elite, and it is very exaggeratedly pro-people. The pro-people position that populists take is actually not a pro-people position. It is a caricature of the people. And this is the point that is made by Hannah Arendt herself, the very famous political theorist. So that really is the problem with populism. And I think we are witnessing a wave of populism across the world, whether it is Brexit in Britain or Trump in America or the current government in India. Populism doesn't really answer. It doesn't answer questions at all. So I hope, Palak, that answers your question. Let me see if there are other questions. Is multiculturalism another form of racism? Shubham has asked me. No, Shubham, I wouldn't agree with that. I think what multiculturalism has done is that it sought to counter racism, but not very effectively, as I said in an earlier part of my lecture. Okay, yeah, that's it. That's in terms of the three questions that popped up in the chat box.
Sir, we have question, sir.
Yeah, please.
So Sweden, Norway, for example, Sweden, Norway, Finland always takes a good rank in Human Development Index, Living Index, Democratic Index.
Yeah.
But sir, there is a security concern about that. A nuclear country ever can push their border, their ground. That's why so many countries build up their nuclear. Then is this right or wrong?
Sorry, Prince, I couldn't hear you. This last sentence, I couldn't hear it all. Just say that again.
So that's why so many countries build up their nuclear weapon. Then how can you say it, sir? Means, मतलब ऐसा करना सही है या गलत? Sir, यही मैं कहना चाहता हूँ.
Well, I mean, if you ask a pacifist like me, I think it's really wrong, because I think aggression in the world is really, really problematic. And to go back to the point that I made about multiculturalism and nation state, I mean, I think the problem is the configuration of the nation state. I mean, generally the nation state is a political entity that's usually steamrolls diversity. It doesn't really take into account diversity. And this is really what we are witnessing across the world. Across the world, we've seen nation states increasingly intolerant of diversity. Now, one view of this is in terms of understanding what are the roots of the nation state. A lot of people trace the roots of the nation state to Europe, and I would agree with that. I think this is a largely European invention. A European invention that other parts of the world have then kind of adopted. All this aggression and all of that, I think, stems from a certain kind of intolerance that comes from within most nation states, which needs to be tempered. That would be my response, Prince, to your question.
Thank you.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah, Sakshi.
Yes, sir. Good evening.
Yeah.
Sir, I wanted to ask that if we see the present crisis around the world on different issues like that you said that discrimination has not been eradicated, and that is the problem with multiculturalism, that it could not actually counter the sort of discrimination it talked about. I want to ask you that in the concept, the idea of multiculturalism, because that I think that highlights the two major points. The first is homogeneity, the homogenization project of nation state, and again the cultural discrimination of minority communities. The two major points it highlights. So this is the idea behind multiculturalism. And when we see the practice on the ground, we can say that execution of the policies have not been able to eradicate the eradicate the kind of discrimination that has been imposed on cultural minorities. But it is not the problem in the idea. I think it is the problem in execution of those idea, and we cannot say that multiculturalism has failed. We can say that the execution was not proper, and that's why it is more relevant to talk about how can we make the project of multiculturalism or the idea of multiculturalism in present context more relevant. And talking about the examples you mentioned in the context of Ukraine, for example, I think that the Putin is arguing that a lot of minorities in Ukraine are Russians, are Russian origin, and he said that the Ukraine is discriminating against them, so he is in the position to defend them, and that's why he's raging against the war. So I think that it is not the problem of it is not the failure of multiculturalism here. It is actually the problem of that Ukraine, that it could not incorporate the multiculturalism in its true spirit, because if it has done so, perhaps it would have the problem of minority discrimination of Russian minority in Ukraine would not have been arisen. So it is not the problem in the concept; it is problem in the execution. And
yes, actually, but I mean, partly I agree with you that the problem was with the execution, and there was a kind of backlash, and there has been a backlash against multiculturalism, which I couldn't talk about because I was running out of time. But let me say one thing about conceptualization. I mean, the reason why I began my talk today by talking about how bad the situation is that when you have a bad situation, you need very large political imagination. To solve the problems of the world right now, one needs a very kind of capacious, all-encompassing political imagination. Now, I don't think an idea like multiculturalism is really up to the contemporary task at all. I mean, what we have right now is, let me take the recent crisis of the world. I mean, the coronavirus pandemic, which we don't know if the pandemic is over. But most solutions that countries have come up with have not been able to solve the problem. So vaccine nationalism, for example, it doesn't solve it. It doesn't make the virus go away. Capitalism, for example, and the immense amounts of money that most pharmaceutical companies are making. And this is what prompted someone like Pope Francis to say that the narrow walls of nationalism do not, they don't keep the virus out. So what I'm suggesting is that right now what is required is a very large political vision, a certain wide political imagination. Now, in that wide political imagination, multiculturalism can play a role, but I don't think it will play a major role at all. The biggest problem in the world right now is the whole question of inequality. I mean, never has the world experienced such high levels of inequality. These are levels of inequality that are simply unsustainable and undesirable and actually very shameful. Multiculturalism, as a set of ideas, doesn't have an answer to this kind of a problem. That would be my response to you, Sakshi.
Hello. But if it's can I counter that?
Okay, go on.
If you allow. Okay. So if we see the problem of inequality, as you mentioned, so inequality is a very abstract idea. It is not something. It is all encompassing. It incorporates economic inequality, cultural inequality, and a lot of type of inequalities. But I don't think there is an idea till now that counters every sort of inequality in itself. So if we talk about multiculturalism, it actually assists the in countering the cultural sort of inequality which exists in present day, and there are people who talk about different types of countering different types of inequalities, such as Dan Barry, for example. He talks about economic inequality, which in which he criticized multiculturalism. So if अगर हम दो चीजों को लेते हैं, अलग अलग क्षेत्रों की अलग अलग टाइप की इनइक्वालिटीज को, तो अगर हम एक चीज को टारगेट करते हैं तो इसका ये मतलब नहीं है कि हम दूसरे को इग्नोर ही कर रहे हैं. Perhaps we are assisting in an overall project of eradicating inequality. It is one person or one ideology or one school of thought cannot incorporate all form of discrimination or all form of inequalities, but it can actually assist in some way in bringing about equality and making society more egalitarian. So it is not sort of ignoring the economic aspect, but it is focusing on particular aspect of cultural inequality, and it is trying to eradicate that. So that is my view.
Well, I mean, Sakshi, we can go on kind of talking about this. Perhaps some other occasion we can talk about this. Yes, I mean, I agree with you that not one particular idea cannot counter everything or cannot provide a solution to everything. But just to kind of go back to what I'm trying to say is, I mean, right now I think the major problem in the world is not so much cultural diversity. I mean, I think the major problem in the world is that a very small set of people are able to control a vast amount of the resources of the world. Now, that's not healthy at all. And I think that is where most of the problems of the world stem from right now. So, yes, I mean, your first point, I agree with you that one set of ideas cannot solve all the problems of the world. But perhaps on some other occasion we can continue this particular conversation.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Okay, anyone else?
Hello, sir. Hello, sir.
Shivani.
Sir, firstly, thank you, sir, for the wonderful lecture. So, I want to ask, as we know that culture is a personal issue that we cannot universalize. And as you also said that it is an attempt to bring out equality. So, does it mean that it is a kind of reform in liberalism or not? If not, then what are the basic points which distinguish liberalism from multiculturalism, sir?
Yeah. Well, to quickly answer that question, Shivani, which actually is a very good question. I mean, the whole attempt to bring in multiculturalism was to kind of expand the ambit of liberalism, to make it, kind of, more expansive rather than narrow. I mean, I'm reminded of an article that I read by Biko Parekh, who's one of the more prominent theorists on multiculturalism, when he talked about the narrowness of liberalism and the need to expand the ambit of liberalism. I think the attempt to bring in culture was all about that, to be able to kind of sensitize people that the autonomy and the choices that liberalism emphasizes are never done in a vacuum, that there's always a certain kind of a cultural context which kind of explains why certain choices are made and why certain other choices are not made. To that extent, I mean, I have no problem with multiculturalism at all. It's I think there's a certain kind of sincerity there. But I think the problem was in terms of the kind of pitfalls and perils that I pointed out to, where I thought that it doesn't really kind of address these issues in a more effective sort of a way. So I hope that answers your concern, Shivani.
So thank you.
So could I ask you? Thank you, sir. Thank you. So you told that a person killed the Britain MPs by saying that British first. You told about the Donald Trump by saying that America first. So and we see that Russia is now in the condition of putting herself as a first. That is Russia first.
Yeah.
If we see these three statements or these 3 points, we conclude that they are in the position of glorifying their past. So I just want to answer one more question. If we move toward our glorifying past, or if we want to revive our glorifying part, then is it the first step that we condemn to multiculturalism or we destroy multiculturalism?
I'm not someone who believes in living in the past, Rishabh. I mean, I don't think that any past was as great as it is projected. I mean, the problem with a lot of revivalist movements is that they talk about a glorious past, they don't talk about a glorious future, and they forget the misery of the present. I think the human situation has always been a situation which it's been a kind of a black and white. So I don't understand why people need to live in the past so much. I mean, what we really are looking at is a situation right now in which large numbers of people across the world are going hungry, malnutrition is increasing amongst children, the child poverty, for example, is increasing. So, to be honest with you, Rishabh, I don't understand why people have to dwell on the past so much, given the fact that the constraints and the situation and the straitened circumstances of the present are so pressing. I think the problem with revivalist movements, I mean, for example, Islamic revivalist movements that I have looked at in some of my own work, one thing I've noticed about them is that they will always dwell in the Islamic past, forgetting that no past was ever as great as it is projected. There must have been, even in the past, however glorious it was, some people who would have cause for complaint. Similarly, they will always talk about a glorious future, and they always neglect the present. And I think that, as someone who works in political theory, I'm always interested in the present, of how the present can be made the basis of a future that is, where there is less hunger, there is less misery, there is less poverty, there is less warfare, rather than this attempt to constantly dwell on the past. I mean, I think that historians can do an adequate job of that if they're allowed to do their work. And historical debates will always happen, and if we allow historians to kind of dwell or work with their sources, which is the way that history writing is to be done. So that would be my response, Rishabh. I think the concerns of the present are so pressing that this constant attempt to dwell in the past defeats any possibility of creating the possibility of a better future. that would be my response, Rishabh. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And now I would ask one of the research students, Kriti Tripathi, to thank Dr. Ali. Over to Kriti Tripathi.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for giving me this opportunity. Ma'am, am I audible?
Yes,
hello, ma'am.
you are audible.
Okay, ma'am. Ma'am, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. First and foremost, I would like to present my vote of thanks on behalf of all the students to our reverend speaker, Professor Amir Ali sir. On behalf of students, I am very thankful to you, sir, that you have given us your precious time. You'll use it and very important lecture.
हाँ सर प्रणाम सर मैम अभी ऑनलाइन लेक्चर में एक हैं इसलिए आवाज नहीं जा पा रही और वो क्राफ्ट टीचर जो है वो आएगी नहीं आज
about the debates and issues around multiculturalism, particularly in the contemporary time. It has also inspired us to think about any issue very dynamically and from various angles. And it is an arena which becomes more important because we are also the students of political science as well as we are citizens of India. So I'm very thankful to you, sir. And it is not just your presentation, but it is your expression and way of oration is something that we students need to learn. And I wish we get another chance to interact with you, that too in real, because real interactions would definitely be very, very interesting. So I'm very thankful to you, sir. Next, I'm very grateful to our head of department, Professor Shubha Rao ma'am, for initiating this lecture series where versatility of concepts makes us much more inquisitive and thoughtful, which also helps us on academic front. Now, as we all know, that no program is successful without an enthusiastic audience. They are the soul of such endeavors. So last but definitely not the least, I'm very much appreciative of this zealful, active and wonderful audience. Thank you. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you, Shruti.
Thank you, Kriti, for those kind words.
Now, I will remind Dr. Ali that one of his classmates, Dr. Pradeep Parida, is also there among the audience, and he wants to extend his thanks to you. Over to Dr. Parida.
Good to see you, Pradeep, after a long time. I can't remember when we last met.